Well, good morning, everyone, from soggy Chicago to our fifth Member Connect webinar. I'm Pete Gustafson, and believe me, it's soggy Chicago. This is officially going to be the wettest May on record in the area. Over the past several weeks, we've brought panels of experts from industrial hygiene and commercial sanitation, medical research, amusement game development and manufacturing, accounting and finance, business coaching, and restaurant and family entertainment facility operation. These industry professionals have shared insights into how we as an industry should be thinking and acting in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we're taking a deeper dive into leadership at times of crisis, clearly the circumstance we find ourselves in now. Over these past several weeks, you, as leaders, have probably asked yourself more than once, am I following the right path? Am I properly and effectively communicating the severity of the situation with my team and guests in a way that empowers and informs without scaring them even more? I hope that by the end of today's presentation, you're able to either confirm what you're doing is correct or gain some valuable knowledge to put you on the right course of action. As with our past webinars, I encourage you to post your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many of your questions as time allows. There will also be a series of poll questions throughout the presentation. Please answer them as they appear so we're able to post the results during today's webinar. Unlike our previous webinars, today's is being led by a single individual, Allison Dell. This conversation will be led by Allison, who's an Executive Director of Talent and Learning for Cineplex. She is specializing in facilitation and coaching. With over 20 years experience in learning and organizational development, she's led high-performing teams, spearheaded award-winning global programs, and implemented organizational and cultural support systems across a wide variety of business verticals. She and her team have been recognized with an array of prestigious industry awards, including the Charles Jennings Award for Excellence in Social Learning, the Brandon Hall Silver Award for Blended Learning, and the Brandon Hall Silver Award for Best Strategy for a Corporate Learning University. And let me share a little bit about the organization she works for, Cineplex. Cineplex, which generated over $420 million in revenue last year, is a leading Canadian brand that operates in the film, entertainment and content, amusement and leisure, and media sectors. As a leading entertainment and media company, Cineplex welcomes over 70 million guests annually through its circuits of theaters and location-based entertainment venues across the country. Cineplex also operates successful businesses in digital commerce, food service, alternative programming, cinema media, digital place-based media, and amusement solutions, the Player One Amusement Group, or P1AG. Additionally, Cineplex operates a location-based entertainment business through Canada's newest destination for eats and entertainment, the Rec Room, and complexes designed for teens and families, Palladium, as well as exciting new sports and entertainment venues across Canada, including Topgolf. Cineplex is a joint venture partner in Scene, Canada's largest entertainment loyalty program. Cineplex's theater circuit is concentrated in major metropolitan and mid-sized markets, and as of December 31st, 2019, Cineplex owned, leased, or had a joint venture interest in 1,693 screens in 165 theaters from coast to coast. Cineplex has been a three-time winner of the Waterstone Top 10 Most Admired Corporate Culture Award and was recognized in 2015 by the Retail Council of Canada with an award for talent development. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Allison Dell, but before I do, I want to once again thank my AAMA team members, Tina Schwartz and Alex Reichstorff. Believe me, none of this occurs without them. And please remember to send in your questions using the Q&A tab and answer the poll questions as they occur. Allison Dell, take it away.
Thank you, Pete. Good morning, everyone, or hello, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is. Thank you so much, Pete, and the AAMA team for inviting me to participate today. That's a lot of pressure to carry a full panel all on my own, but I'm gonna do my best to keep it interesting, to keep it engaging. And I don't pretend to know your business as well as you know your business, but what I thought I would share with you is a little bit of what Cineplex has done to really help and support its leadership teams across our circuit to lead through crisis. Because as Pete mentioned, I mean, arguably this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest crisis most of us have faced, certainly in recent history. Before we dive in, I'm always curious to get the chat going. Using the chat function, I'd love to hear, what are your chief concerns or biggest challenges? What are the challenges that you're facing leading your teams through COVID? Love to get a little feedback and see what you've got going on. And Tina, I'm not sure if that's coming in, or Pete through the Q&A window, if you're starting to see any feedback, or if people can see that in the chat. Thanks, Tina, for posting that question.
No, nothing yet, Allison.
Okay, great. Maintaining a positive mindset. Thank you. Thanks, Christian. I think that's something that we're all struggling with. If you're self-isolating, or if you're, staying place, you're somewhere where you don't have the support of your community, you don't have the connections with your coworkers, that mindset can be a big obstacle. Team members feeling safe at work, Brian, I really appreciate that. We've talked a lot in talent and leadership around this idea of psychological safety and how to create a high trust environment, making them feel safe, whether those are our customers or our employees. Overcoming people making more on unemployment. Oh, that's a big obstacle to reopening, isn't it? That people might feel like they're better off staying home. Communicating information that's not likely to change. So how do you stay current? How do you stay connected when things don't change day to day, hour by hour? At what point might we go overboard with our new measures and our procedures? So trying to find that balance, that line between being effective and being efficient. All right, great. And potential decline in revenue makes it hard to keep staff on board. I mean, that's certainly the case for us. I don't think it would be a surprise as a theater, exhibition, and amusement organization that the vast majority of our locations are not opening. In fact, none of our guest-facing businesses have remained open aside from some food delivery services that we're running. So that's certainly been a challenge at Cineplex. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Some of what I'm going to talk to you about is hopefully going to give you some insight into what we've done as an organization to help bridge some of those similar challenges, but also maybe give you some ideas that you can ideally take away with and apply to your own businesses. So thank you so much for sharing. What I wanted to share with you initially is really how we have approached leading through this crisis. And while we've done many different things, necessity is the mother of invention, and that's definitely been the case when it's come to our approach. We, in the talent and learning and communication space, we've really focused on these three things. We focused on communication, connection, and development. So under the banner of communication, we've implemented weekly CEO communications. So Ellis Jacob, our CEO, sends a weekly memo out to all employees to share his insights, his feelings about the organization, where we're headed, what we're wrestling with, just as a way to connect and to communicate the most recent news. Even if news hasn't changed, sharing his own observations, working with others in other industries across the North America and the world, it's been a really nice way for people to feel connected to that executive sentiment. So that's been weekly CEO communications. We've also encouraged our senior leadership team to make daily touch points, to connect with their people, to reach out, see how people are doing. Someone in the chat was mentioning that important consideration of safety, helping people feel safe. So we've really encouraged our senior leaders, which are executive directors and VPs across the organization, to make sure that they're connecting with their teams, that they're staying current and are aware of how people are feeling, sharing news where they can, but also just making a human connection. And the other thing that we've done is we used to have quarterly virtual town halls, and we've actually increased the frequency of those town halls over the duration of the crisis. So just keeping people a little bit more connected, whether it's been through formal town halls or whether it's been more informal ask me anything type sessions where we've opened the floor to the organization to submit their questions to executives in different areas. It's really been a way, again, of communicating. Even if we didn't have anything new to say, that communication has been so important. The transparency and authenticity around what we're all collectively experiencing has really helped the Cineplex community come together and feel more connected. And connection is the second pillar. And under the first bullet under connection is the lobby, which is a central system that we implemented in the month of March, end of March, beginning of April. We use a platform called Microsoft Teams, which is really just a collaboration platform that's available through Microsoft. And what we did is we launched a collaboration site for the entire organization. It's the first time we've ever had one place to really bring people together, to connect socially, to share pictures of, our dogs keeping us company while we're working. Or some of us have young children in the house and have toddlers on their laps while they're taking conference calls. Or some of us have jumped on the sourdough bandwagon. I don't know if sourdough is a thing where you are, but sourdough has somehow been a big thing where I am. And so we've been posting recipes and really coming together to foster that sense of connection and community. And it's been incredibly powerful, as being the first time that we've done that across our 10,000 employees, or actually 3,000 corporate and salaried employees. We've also taken a big focus on health and wellness. So offering webinars that focus on resilience and managing stress and mental health and financial well-being. Or we have one of our executive who offers Meditation Mondays, and she's put the offer out to the organization to join her for 5 minutes of meditation every Monday in the month of May. So these small little opportunities to really come together again to create that sense of community has really helped galvanize the organization, rally us around a single purpose, but also create a broader sense of community and connection between us all. And the last thing is pulse checks under the banner of connection. It's a way to stay connected again to how people are feeling, whether it's a pulse check that just simply asks, how have you been feeling in the last 7 days? Or a pulse check to get more information or insight into how people are feeling about remote working, what tools or resources they might need. And now that we start to turn our attentions to reopening and resuming operations, how are people feeling about that idea of coming back to work? And what can we do to help them feel safer? So we've used this idea of pulse checks to periodically reach out in a more intentional way than purely through conversation to get feedback from our leaders across the organization. And then the last pillar is under development. And that's really what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time chatting with you about, is what we've done around how we've handled remote working. We launched webinars to support people as they became more familiar with the remote working and collaboration platforms. We've expanded our leadership curriculum to be offered virtually through webinars like this one. And then we've done a lot around leadership development, whether it's building a strong foundation of leadership or some very intentional work around building trust, creating psychological safety, and leading through change. And that's really the focus of what I'm going to chat with you about, is share some excerpts of the building trust content and the leading change content to give you a sense of how we're talking to our leadership teams about leading through the crisis, with the hope that there's some value and merit in that for you. So with that, I'm going to jump in. Pete, any questions come through around communication, connection, or the broad strategy we've taken?
Well, for sure. Mike Abacassis put a good one in, and it's about getting buy-in from your team members. I'll quote him. He says, "We are in danger of having our team members get compliant. When this happens, we are exposed to guests taking photos and posting those on social media. What steps have you taken to get buy-in from frontline team members, those that interact directly with the guest?"
I think that question is speaking specifically about reopening, and when we start to implement new protocols, how are we making sure that people are going for the long term going to feel connected to the importance of those protocols? Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So we're just starting that work now. And I would say where we are aiming to get the greatest degree of compliance, or not compliance, but rather commitment, stems from a couple of things. It stems from our focus on building trust from leaders, and I'll share more about that in just a moment. But really having that strong foundation and that strong connection with our people so that they feel valued, appreciated, and that they have leaders that they trust, and a culture that they feel connected to, that it connects with their personal values and with their intent and desire to do good work and to keep people safe. I think the other way that we're aiming to get commitment, not just compliance, is really by reaching out via the pulse checks. We did a sentiment survey with all of our hourly employees. We're just in the process of doing a full sentiment survey with our salaried employees at the moment to understand what their greatest concerns are. And part of what we've asked is, how worried are you about your own safety and the safety of others, whether it's your colleagues or our guests? And I think leveraging some of the insight that we've gained through those surveys is going to help us make sure that we're aligning protocols to those things that people feel are most important, and that we're staying connected to the why, not just the what and the how, but why we're going to do these measures, why we're going to put these protocols in place, and really using that as sort of the springboard for all of our communication around new process. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, let's get into some of the leadership messaging a little bit more. I don't know if any of you are hearing a lot of this talk about VUCA or VUCA, that we're living in a high VUCA world. VUCA is an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And based on the challenges that you wrote in the initial chat, I think you're feeling it the same way we're feeling it, that we're certainly in a high degree of volatility. We're certainly a lot of uncertainty as to what the future holds, how reopening is going to work. We're just starting to reopen here in Canada, what that's going to look like, how we're going to service our guests and keep our people safe, the complexity of all the different moving parts across our circuit and multiple lines of business, and then the ambiguity as to what the future looks like. How will COVID-19 influence and shape our industries for the long term? Will things ever go back to the way they were? And the answer is probably not. So what we're doing is we're helping our leaders focus on, when you're in a VUCA world, when you're in a high degree of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, there are ways that it's important for leaders to respond. But before I get into them, Tina, let's pull up that first poll. I'd love to get a sense from the team. What are the elements that you or your team are feeling the most right now? Which parts of VUCA are you experiencing? Is it the volatility that's weighing on you, the uncertainty, the complexity, or the ambiguity? So we'll get that poll up. I'm not seeing the poll on my screen, Pete. Are you seeing it on yours?
I am not, no.
Allison, give me 1 second on that.
Thanks, Tina. Pete's going to keep me honest on the Q&A, and Tina's going to keep
sure.
us moving on the poll.
Well, there's a question from Peter Sheff. How do you keep everyone believing we have a safe place? He's got a couple parts to it. Keeping employees willing to come back to likely less pay than unemployment, and how to float a business with likely 25 to 50% less cash flow. There's quite a few parts to that if you want to pull it apart and unpack it and see if there's some insight you can provide.
Okay. I'll start with feeling safe. So that idea of the concept of psychological safety, that people want to feel like they're obviously we want them to be safe. So first and foremost, it's having integrity around the practices that we're putting in place to make sure that we are taking measures, that our actions support our words, that our actions show that our intent to keep people safe is being evidenced by the work that we're doing. And I think one of the strengths that we have working in our favor is we have a very values-based culture, and we have a high degree of communication and transparency. So we really make an effort to keep talking, even if it feels like it's too much sometimes. It's better to over-communicate in a crisis than under-communicate. And really focusing again on the why we're putting measures in place, connecting back to our values of teamwork, innovation, and excellence, really letting the organization understand that the decisions we're making in order to keep them safe. So I think that's first and foremost. How to bring people back when they might make more at home. In Canada, we've got a little bit of flexibility that people are able to they're able to work some hours while still earning some of the government support through the crisis. So there's a bit of a balance there that's available in Canada. But I think over and above that, we hire people who want to contribute, who want to work, who get a lot of intrinsic satisfaction out of being there to support our guests, and who want to be productive. So we're really hoping to re-engage with those teams, again, helping them understand the why and connect to the bigger picture of what we're doing. Pete and I were chatting before the webinar started that we're not, saving lives or building rocket ships, but we're putting smiles on people's faces. And I think there's a lot of value and merit that the world needs a little fun, and that we have an opportunity to add to that. So I think we're trying to capitalize on some of those intrinsic values. But I would say a lot of that really comes back to the connection between the leaders and their teams, and that very authentic, transparent communication that we put in place. Thanks for the question. There is a lot there about operating the business or floating a business with 25 to 50% less cash flow. I think one of the things that I've learned working with leaders across our business is focusing on what's most important, that through a crisis, doing fewer things but doing them well, and trying to stay focused on the most important things and the most important work has helped us achieve a bit more efficiency. But that's a big nut to crack, Pete, and I'm sorry I don't have a silver bullet for you there. All right, we've got that poll up. Thank you, Tina. So thinking about that VUCA model, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which of those elements are you guys feeling? And you can check more than one box. Hopefully we'll see some of that voting come through.
And then while we're waiting for that to post, another question from Joe Ingwe. Managing our team members in quarantine and how to keep everyone challenged mentally and physically.
Oh, what a great question. So what we've done on our global team site that I was mentioning earlier, the lobby around physical challenges is under the banner of health and wellness. We've actually, we've brought in some of our senior leaders and asked them to create challenges on the lobby to keep people moving and keep people motivated. So I can think of one team where they have like in every hour they're supposed to stand up for 5 minutes. And so we've again engaged with senior leaders to stay connected with their teams and to create these small challenges to help keep people moving. We're also, when we launched our remote working channel, we put a lot of emphasis on creating boundaries because that's one of the challenges that people have articulated to me as we've moved over to remote working, is that life bleeds into work and work bleeds into life. So it can be really difficult to carve out space for self-care. So we talk about it. We try and create fun ways and fun challenges for people to engage with it. And then we also encourage people to set boundaries in their day, to block out their lunch hour, to block out the beginning of the day and their end of the day, and to really have good conversations with their leaders and their teams about how to respect those boundaries. All right, looking at the results of the poll, thank you, Tina. It looks like uncertainty is the one that's plaguing most of us at this moment of time, and that's not at all surprising. Thanks, Tina. We can take that poll away. So some of the techniques or tips for leaders when you're living in a high VUCA world is really around, if you're dealing with volatility, it's about having vision. So as much as you can, keeping the big picture in mind and keeping optimism for the future. Because you as a leader, someone mentioned earlier on the importance of mindset. If you're maintaining an optimistic outlook and without forecasting too far down the road because of all the uncertainty that we're experiencing, that having that clear vision and communicating that optimism for the future can help your teams feel optimistic as well. When you're in a world of uncertainty, articulating a lot of understanding. So taking time to connect with people on a more personal level, creating that sense of safety that comes from a strong foundation of trust so people can focus on what's most important. When you're dealing with complexity, it's about clarity. So again, creating focus, sharing information transparently so that teams can make decisions, clear decisions, that your leaders feel like they have the authority that they need to make decisions that really are in the best interest of their teams and their customers. And even when the answers aren't clear, to be honest about that, to share what you don't know, can go a long way to fostering trust and creating a sense of safety. And then when you're dealing with ambiguity, it's about agility. And I know that's a bit of a four-letter word. I hear agile all the time in my work. Really what I'm talking about is being flexible and involving others in decision-making so that it doesn't feel like an autocracy where all the decisions are coming down from the top necessarily, but you're engaging in some dialogue and inviting your teams into the conversation. And I know in today's environment, a lot of these are really challenging. It's hard to have a clear vision for the future when you're dealing with so much uncertainty and so much ambiguity. And I'm sure most of us feel quite empathetic for our teams, but we also have to run our businesses and we're operating with 25 to 50% less cash flow. So we have to make really tough decisions. And I think a lot of that, again, some of those decisions are hard to make, but when you're transparent and clear about the why and you're sharing that information, keeping people involved in the decision-making, it makes it easier to digest for them. And it really starts with this idea of trust. And like most things, I love this picture, but it's literally like a ripple in a pool of water, that leading through a crisis starts from the inside out. It starts with self-awareness, understanding how you're feeling about the crisis. It starts with self-regulation, meaning you're responding appropriately, you're managing your emotions, you're managing your responses to connect with your teams, and that you're leaning on your values and your culture. You're really thinking about, what does it mean to be part of this community? And how do we make tough decisions? And how do we share that? And then from there, leadership radiates outward, creating that wave of trust through the organization. So borrowing a line from Stephen Covey, I just wanted to talk, let's begin with the end in mind and talk a little bit about why trust is so important. If I think about the state of trust in the world today, and there's this great barometer, it's a measure for trust called the Edelman. I would encourage everyone, if you're interested in this kind of work, to look into it. But we could go back to, 2007, if I think about the current state of trust across the world, and Enron, with the Enron scandal in 2007, I can't believe it was 2007. It feels like it was just yesterday. That was such a great example of trust in corporations being eroded. So for those of you who don't know what Enron was, they had fake holdings and off the books accounting, and it led to the bankruptcy of what was one of the largest companies in America. And it created this, or started this wave of, can we really trust large corporations? And that really got dramatic if you think about 2011 and Occupy Wall Street. And again, politics aside, this was really about an erosion of trust in the banks. So all those large-scale protests across the world, challenging banks and governments and challenging the inequitable distribution of wealth. To me, it's not about the politics, but this was such an interesting moment in trust to really see a loss of faith in these large institutions. Then let's get a little bit more modern in 2016. Again, politics aside, whichever side of the fence you were on, the whole Colin Kaepernick taking a knee to protest police violence, whether it was a loss of trust in the police, in that institution of keeping people safe, or if it was a loss of trust in the public figure and in role models. This was a really interesting moment for us in the global evolution of trust. And then again, fake news, again, politics aside, the loss of trust in the media, that people aren't sure where to go to get real information. All of that creates a destabilization in the whole idea of trust in the world. And then take it to COVID, where we are now. How do we know what sources are telling us the truth? How do we know when it's really safe? What's going to make us safest? There's a great deal of speculation and lack of trust, even in some of our medical institutions. So all of that to say that if we measure it, global trust is kind of at an all-time low. But what's really interesting is since 2019, reliance on employers as a trusted source of information is climbing. So people want to eyeball see the people who are their employers as being people they can trust, and people and organizations that they can look to for guidance. So the level of trust has a direct impact on business results. There's a tangible business case. So again, using the chat, I'd love to get some feedback. Think about a person or a time you've worked with someone that you have low trust with that person. Just using the chat, how would you describe working with someone with whom you've got low trust? And I'll give you a couple minutes to think that through. How would you describe working with someone with whom you've got low trust? Miserable. Beth, I know. Thank you. Frustrating, Dawn. I love it. You can't wait to get out of here. Hopefully not here, John, but get out of the situation. Uncertain. Thanks, Judy. Yeah, absolutely. When you've got low trust with someone, it's tiring. It feels like the need to follow up. You've got to be extra careful. You've got to dot all your I's, cross all your T's. For me, some of us, it might even, I love it, Beth, looking behind, we might even actively try and avoid them. It's emotionally draining, Bill. Thank you. So what's really interesting is trust in an organization tends to impact two variables. And when you've got low trust, speed goes down. If you're dotting I's, looking behind, you got to go back and circle back to make sure everything's clear and you're protecting yourself. It's going to slow you down. And when speed goes down, cost goes up. And this is directly from The Speed of Trust from Stephen M. R. Covey's best-selling book from 2006. So trust tends to impact the variables of speed and cost. And when you've got low trust, speed goes down, you're slower, and costs go up. You're watching your back, and you probably won't be able to work with that person again. Thanks, Tammy, I appreciate it. So let's flip the switch. What if you're working with someone with whom you've got high trust? Using the chat, describe for me, what's that like? If low trust is slow and painful and costly, what's high trust like? Fun, motivating. Thanks, John. Thanks, Beth. Creates energy. I love it. Confident, happy, creative. Thanks, Judy. All right, I love it. All of those things. So when you've got high trust, if you're feeling fun, that you're creating energy, there's confidence there, you tend to operate a little bit more quickly. I know the people in my life that I work with where I've got the highest degree of trust, it's like we have a secret language and we just sort of vibe off each other. So speed goes up and cost goes down because we've got that strong foundation of trust. When I think about this in the context of the crisis, if you're able to create connections and touch points with your people, keep them involved in the decision, keep talking about the why, lean on your values and lean on your culture. If you're transparent, if you take ownership of the challenges that people are experiencing, you're really there for them, that creates a high trust environment. And that allows you to operate with greater speed and lower cost. So when we think about 25 to 50% less, less revenue, if you've got high trust, you can make more out of that smaller pool of resources. So most of us, I think, would argue, or it looks like most of us feel like it's easier to work in a high trust environment. And some of you even said it was fun. So at Cineplex, what we've done to start the conversation around trust and leading in a crisis is really focused on this idea of paradigms. So starting with, again, the inside out, what's your mindset for change? Now, we work a lot with the Franklin Covey group. We're members of their All Access Pass Plus program, which means we leverage a lot of Covey materials and Covey content for our leadership development. So that was that third pillar that I'm talking you through. And the conversation really started with that internal, what's your mindset? How do you see the crisis? How do you see change? Because that has a direct influence on what you do. How you see the world determines how you show up in the world, and that determines the results that you get. So if you're looking at today's crisis through the mindset or lens of hopelessness or defeatedness, then you're going to show up in a way that conveys that to your team, where you don't have optimism for the future, where you might be feeling hopeless, and that's going to definitely make them feel less safe. So if you can find a way to shift your mindset to be optimistic that yes, these are challenging times, but you know what, we're going to get through them together, and we're resilient and we're creative and we're going to figure it out. We're going to make the most of what's available to us. Then you're going to show up in a way that is creative, that's solving problems, that's involving people in the solution. And that's going to garner higher levels of trust and more productivity for the team. So it's really about shifting that mindset from feeling what could be quite hopeless in the face of this COVID crisis that we can't control. We don't have any control over the virus. That's something that happens to us potentially. I hope not. I hope we're all safe and well. But if we look at the situation as an opportunity to drive innovation in our business with optimism for the future, then we show up in a way that encourages innovation and optimism, and those are the results that we get. So I want to start with a little bit of a conversation around paradigms. This is a pretty typical mindset for change. A very common mindset is that I control and contain change for my team. So when you're looking at that, I'm just curious, if this is your mindset for change, I control and contain change for my team, how do you show up? Using the chat again, how would you recognize someone who has that mindset? What behavior would you expect to see? What are some examples of controlling and containing change for your team? Okay, could be asking questions, taking time for yourself. Maybe authoritative, Jason, thank you for that. Could be clear messaging and leadership, absolutely. Decisive, yeah, thanks, Pete, absolutely. Not all of this is bad. This is a very common approach, and there's a lot of, sometimes in a crisis, we need to be authoritative. In order to help people feel safe, we need to show people that we're making clear decisions. Having proper tools, absolutely. What's really interesting is when we look at shifting mindsets subtly. If I were to say a great and the common mindset, I control and contain change for my team, the more effective mindset is I champion change with my team. When you look at those two mindsets in comparison, how would someone with the mindset of championing change with their team show up? How would that look different? Thanks, Pete. Seeks buy-in, for sure. So if you are championing change with your team, that's a two-way dialogue. A collaborative effort. Thanks, Joe. How else might someone who champions change with their team? What else stands out to you as you look at that? Want to assist in any way. I love it because that's about partnership. It's not about authority necessarily. So some of the things that these leaders with an effective mindset do differently is exactly what you've described. They're thinking about the change positively. When you control and contain change for your team, you're actually projecting that you believe the change needs to be contained. When you're championing change with your team, you're embracing the change. You're looking at it through the lens of opportunity. So it's a really subtle difference, but it's kind of an interesting and effective difference. And the one you really nailed, it's positive messaging. Thanks, John. Controlling and containing feels like something you do for people, but championing is something you do with people. And you already talked about that, getting buy-in and being more collaborative in your approach. So sometimes the first mindset can feel like micromanaging or being a bit of a control freak or autocratic, but I actually think that this is often the unintended consequence of a really great mindset, which is we care really deeply about our people. We care really deeply about our customers. We care really deeply about our business. And sometimes we want to be that human shock absorber because we want to protect our teams. We want to shelter them and make sure that they're okay. So in doing that, what we end up doing, one of the unintended consequences that we're projecting to them that the change is something that needs to be controlled and that they may not be a part of the solution. So instead shifting to that mindset, and even in this crisis, that, okay, there's optimism for the future. We will get through this. We're going to get through it together. We might even come out the other end of it better in some ways than how we went in. And when you feel or think about change or think about a crisis in that way, you get a very different outcome. You get a more collaborative outcome where people feel included in the decision making. They're part of the solution. Because they're working through the change with you instead of having change happen to them. They're part of it. So the first step is really recognizing that change is a cycle. So this is a model that I'm going to show you that's straight out of our Covey Leading Change program. It's a really great program. And I love this model because what it really talks about is results over time and how change, and certainly in a crisis, how change impacts or influences those results. So we start off in the zone of status quo, which was all of us up into probably about March 12th of 2020, where we were kind of trucking along, doing our great work, achieving good results, but really in that sort of status quo of our day-to-day business. And then boom, change happens. And when change happens, there's a dip in performance that go into the zone of disruption. And the zone of disruption is the part of the curve where it's kind of like the free fall, where you've got feelings of uncertainty, you're not sure where you're going to land, how it's going to land, that the experience is going to end up being okay. And really the only way out of the zone of disruption is to make a decision about the change. And that's a decision to accept it. And once you've made the decision to accept the change or to acknowledge that you're in a crisis, then you get into the zone of adoption where over time performance starts to go up again. But in the zone of adoption, it looks like a solid line here, but it's a lot of peaks and valleys, and there's a squiggly line I'll show you in just a moment. It's all the mess of change, of figuring it all out. Now that I've decided I'm on board and I've accepted where I am, I have to figure out how to put one foot in front of the other, and that can be really challenging and difficult. Until we get into the zone of better performance, which is where you reap all the benefits of the change that you've been through. So if I think of it in the terms of a crisis, the zone of better performance is once we're taking all of the gifts of the crisis, which is about ingenuity and connection and getting through in common purpose and getting through something together, how do we come out of it better than we were before? There's cost to an organization and change. And Tina, I don't know if we can get that poll up, but I'm curious, what areas of the curve do you think organizations experience higher cost? Is it the zone of status quo, the zone of disruption, the zone of adoption, or the zone of better performance? We'll give you a few moments just to get your voting in. Oops, sorry. Okay, and how are we doing on voting there? Should be getting pretty close.
We've still got voters coming in.
Okay, give them a couple more moments. While we're waiting for the votes to come in, Pete, any questions in the Q&A that we should pause to take?
Let me take a look at what we've got here. There's one about redemption counters we can get to toward the end. They're asking how to keep our staff safe when we do reopen, when we offer a redemption story. Do you have any ideas on how to do this safely? My answer to that would be, get present to the CDC guidelines for sanitation and cleanliness and PPEs. That would be, necessary to keep you safe. I don't know if you can add to that at all, Allison?
I think that's probably the best advice, Pete. All right, so excellent, thank you. So it looks like zone of disruption and zone of adoption are the two winners when it comes to the poll. Thanks, Tina, we can put that poll away. And that's absolutely right. In an organization, that's really where the cost of change takes place, is in the zone of disruption and the zone of adoption. All of that place, all of that space where it's cluttered and you're trying to figure out how to make it work. And really the role of the leader is to acknowledge that people have moved through this curve at their own pace. You can't push someone through faster, but if you can engage and connect and be transparent and have those open lines of communication, you can shorten that curve. That's where you're going to have the bigger impact and the opportunity for more efficiency. So just looking at the zones a little bit more closely, again, as I mentioned, the zone of status quo is about that day-to-day prior to the change of the crisis, and some leadership behaviors that you can put in place that we talk to our leaders about is to make change part of the day-to-day. So making sure that we're always encouraging continuous improvement, that we're fostering a growth mindset, so helping people grow and learn even when we're in the day-to-day in the zone of status quo. We're cross-training, we're rotating team members through different channels, we're giving the opportunity to learn from one another, that we're keeping those channels of communication open, and that we're empathetic to different reactions. In the zone of disruption, that's where you kind of cross into the free fall, that pit of despair, of uncertainty. And the key takeaway for this zone is you fail if you give up too soon. You got to stick with it and have a vision for that future, and make sure that you get people to the decision point. And it looks more like this than a solid line down. It's really kind of like the stages of grief, that people move through change and they start with shock or immobilization. They can get into denial. So defending against it, it doesn't seem real. And as a leader, you need to have those reminders of reality. That people might be angry about where we are, resentful about not getting their hours. Obviously, some really tough decisions that had to be made as we went through the initial stages of COVID, and even tougher decisions as we come out of it. So it's about legitimizing, not personalizing, helping people to regain a sense of control, focusing on what they can control. Bargaining is often something that people feel, trying to minimize the impact, and keeping people grounded in those reality reminders. We can even have deep depression, so frustration, feelings of loss, low coping, and for there, leaders need to be supportive and encourage responsibility. People testing, trying to see new alternatives. Maybe they're trying something else that's new, seeing how it works. And as a leader, helping people explore those realistic options until people eventually get to acceptance, that decision point when they're responding to change realistically. And that's about an acknowledging progress and planning ahead. And the reality is that you go through this, but it's not linear. One day you might feel like you're at acceptance, and the next day you might go back to anger. And that if you're jumping back and forth in your own emotions in response to crisis, that's how your team is feeling as well. So it's not just important to know where you are, but to really check in those daily connection points with your team members as much as you can to see where they are. And here's what that looks like in terms of real conversations. It's having key messages that you can keep coming back to. So earlier on in the chat, someone asked about fostering trust and helping people feel safe. Having a clear, consistent message and that optimism for the future that you keep coming back to keeps those decisions connected and grounded to your values. And you use those sort of conversation tools as you navigate that zone of disruption to get people to acceptance, which is the decision point. Now, once you're in acceptance, then we've got the mess of the zone of adoption. And this is probably my favorite graphic of all time, where the reality is it kind of feels like this. And this is how we talk to our leaders about change and about crisis, is that once we get to the point where we've decided to make the change or we've accepted the new reality, all the work of figuring out how to make that work from a day-to-day. So if the zone of status quo, is the safety zone, and the zone of disruption is the zone of uncertainty, the zone of adoption is the zone of frustration. Here it's one step forward and 3 steps back, and that's kind of where we're getting into now, is how do we now operate in this new environment? So own it when things go wrong, because they will. So as you're taking one step forward and 3 steps back, it's being transparent and clear about the decision-making that went into those choices. But also, if that doesn't work out, it's okay. And to make trial and error okay. To stay optimistic and focused on that zone of better performance, that we will get through it. And we might get through it even stronger than we came into it. Celebrating early wins and learning from your mistakes, focusing on the end goal and what matters most, and trying not to sweat the small stuff. So in conversations that I'm having with other heads of talent and other organizations, there's lots of conversations now about measuring productivity while people are working remotely. How do we know people are working? How do we know people are working? I would actually equate that to small stuff. Let's focus on results. Let's focus on staying connected. Let's focus on the end goal, and try not to sweat the small stuff as much. And then we get into the zone of better performance, which is really when you get to reap the rewards of having made it through the crisis or the change. And that's when all of the, the results that you're getting start to improve. And some of the leadership behaviors around that are making sure that you're celebrating success and sharing credit, that you're connecting results to your culture and your values. So again, you're coming back to the why. And I know I've said that many times, and I think as a leadership practitioner, communicating the why can be one of the biggest impacts you can have as a leader, making the shift from just purely what and how to why, bringing people along in the decisions. And if you want to create a feedback culture, the best way to create it is to ask for it. So solicit feedback from your teams. How are they feeling? How are they responding to your leadership in this moment? What can you do more of? Or what can you do differently to help them feel even safer or stronger coming out of this? Continuing to commit to the future, continue to focus on growth and development and continuous improvement. Okay, so we've got a double poll that Tina's going to bring up in a moment, and I'm curious, if you look at those zones, where are you along the curve, and where do you think your team is if you think about our current crisis? Are you in the zone of status quo? I'd be shocked if people feel like they're there, but maybe they are, in which case I want to learn more about your organization. Are you in the zone of disruption still, that feeling of uncertainty? Are you in the zone of adoption, that frustration of trying to figure it all out? Or are you in the zone of better performance where you're coming out stronger than you were going in? What about your team? Where are they in relationship? I'll give you a few moments. To get your voting in.
And Allison, while we're waiting, I had a question from Kevin Williams, and it's specific to your organization. Are you planning to have a waiver that either team members or guests have to sign concerning COVID-19 as part of your entry into a rec room, Palladium, or Cineplex?
Like an attestation of health that
Correct.
I'm not experiencing these symptoms?
Right.
We are still looking at how we're going to reopen. That is one of the options that we have considered, more on the employee side than on the guest side. So unfortunately, I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but it is something that we're looking at right now.
Thank you.
All right, I'm so curious to see. Okay, great. So it looks like the majority of us are feeling in that zone of adoption. The frustration, like we've come to terms with it, we've accepted it, and now we've got to figure it all out. And what's really interesting is that our teams, the majority of us see our teams split between the zone of disruption and the zone of adoption. And I think that's so important as a leader to recognize that if you're further ahead of your team on the curve, it's important to understand that you've got to bring your people with you. And sometimes that can feel frustrating. Sometimes I hear leaders talk about that they might feel calmer, they might feel safer. You've had more time to think about this, you're closer to the decision making. So in many instances, it's natural that you would be further along in the curve, but it can also feel frustrating. You might feel annoyed if your team seems negative, or they seem resistant to change, or they can't quite get on board. Or sometimes I've heard leaders describe their teams as moving slowly, hanging on to the past. That's great. Whenever I hear a leader say, my team's just hanging on to the past, to me, that's symptomatic that they might be further along the change curve than others. It may not be the case, but it might be just that you're closer to the decision making. So it's really important to remember that typically as leaders, we have more information and more time to process it. We've got to bring our teams along with us. And if you feel like your team is further ahead of you on the curve, then that's important for you to recognize as well. Because that might feel to you like they're rushing to make decisions without thinking them through. It might feel to you that you want to kind of control the pace of change because it feels like it's happening too quickly, or you might want to pull them back into uncertainty because we don't have all the answers when they've already reached the decision point. So there are no right or wrong answers. And as I said earlier, there's no silver bullets. Unfortunately, I'm not here to tell you that there's one best way to do it. But I think what I am here to offer is that what's most important to take away from this discussion is that you have a significant role to play in helping your team move into the zone of better performance by being that strong, present leader and having that open, transparent communication. That's how you're going to minimize the cost of disruption and adoption. And there's no good talent presentation that doesn't have a good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs in it. But I think in times of crisis, I often come back to Maslow's hierarchy. That explains that it's really difficult for people to focus on work or the greater good or the long-term strategy of an organization when their fundamental psychological and safety needs aren't being met. So if you feel threatened in those bottom parts of the pyramid, it's very, very difficult to stretch past those threats into the higher performing threats. So for many of our colleagues, COVID presents a very real threat to their physical and financial health and well-being, which means they might be stuck in the zone of disruption for a prolonged period of time. And that's where your empathy and your optimism and your encouragement to get to the decision point are so important in helping bring people along. So some final tips on leading through crisis. I love the first one, put your own oxygen mask on first. Your people are going to draw calm from you. They're going to take your cue about how to approach this, whether they can see this through the lens of optimism or whether they see it through the lens of despair, really starts with how you're feeling about it on the inside. So put your own oxygen mask on first and take care of yourself so you can be calm and they can be calm. To be authentic, to talk authentically and sincerely about what's going on, to own it, to talk about the why, not just what, but the why is so important. Giving your undivided attention, being present and reaching out to people. So there's one of the most winningest basketball coaches in history talks about 5 seconds per player per day. And that's just a quick touch point with every player on the team, even if it's just a high five as they come off and on the court. Now, obviously we can't do that in our current COVID environment, but that's an analogy. Even if it's just a quick reach out, a text if you're on Slack or however you communicate with your team, just to say, hey, I'm thinking about you. How are you feeling today? So being present and reaching out, staying optimistic, focusing on the opportunity. What can we learn and take from this crisis into how we do business going forward? Communicating often, keeping the door open, and focusing on the near term to really stay grounded in what's within our control. We can't control what's happening in the external environment, but we can control our response to it and how we plan to move forward from it. And then finally, this idea of prioritizing self-care. Self-care is no longer a nice to have, it really is a need to have, and it builds from the idea of putting on your own oxygen mask first. So it's about physical care. So making sure that you're sleeping, stretching, walking, that you're eating healthy, that you're doing whatever you need to do to have a physical release, because so many of us are spending so long now, either indoors or isolated or sitting in seats in front of computers, and we may not be used to that. So making sure that you're carving out time and boundaries in the day to allow for some physical outlet, that you're in touch with your emotional well-being, that you understand where you're stressed and how to manage that stress, that you're practicing some good forgiveness and compassion and kindness for yourself and for others, that you've got social wellness, that you've got boundaries, but you've got good support systems, you've got positive social media, that you've got outlets for communicating with people, connecting on a more social level. And then the last category is around spiritual, whatever that means to you, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, whether it's just time to yourself, whether it's connecting with nature, whether it's something that's religious or a sacred space where you can really connect to that higher feeling. For me, it's walking my dog outside. That to me is a very spiritual thing that I do every day. And so these are important elements of self-care so that you can be your best self, even when you're leading through crisis. So we've got a double poll. The last poll, I think, of the day. Thank you, Tina. She's got that loaded right away. Which element of self-care are you doing well? And which element of self-care would you like to focus more on? I'm curious to see how you guys are feeling. And I know that maybe self-care isn't something we're used to talking about as much. But I would really challenge you to think about it and make it a bit of a priority, and to connect with your teams on what they're doing, to have really good conversations with your people about how they're prioritizing their own self-care. I'll give you a few moments for those votes to come in.
And while we're waiting for that, a question came in, and it's a good question as to, it might be more theater than effective, but will you be doing temperature checks of guests as they enter your facilities?
That is another avenue that we're exploring. And again, I wish I could give you the concrete answers, but we're just now in Canada starting to do our reopening planning, and we're entertaining a variety of different safety measures. And that's one of them that we're considering, but we have not made any decisions yet as to, we'll be making them soon, like in the next couple of weeks. But we don't have any firm decisions on what practices we're going to be putting in place. Aside from safe distancing and some of the PPE, some of these other protocols, we're still weighing the options and considering the options. Sorry, Mike, I wish I could give you a concrete answer on that one. Thanks, Pete.
You bet.
Okay, so we've got the results of the poll in. Awesome. So it looks like many of you you feel like you're doing well with physical wellness and emotional wellness. So that's great. I want to acknowledge that. That's really healthy, and many people are struggling in those areas. So congratulations. I'm really happy that you're taking care of yourself in that way. And a few of you also on the social and spiritual side. But many of you, sorry, Tina, that last result on the teams, yeah, still wanting to help our teams across the board in all of these areas. So like we did with our lobby, if there's a way, thanks Tina, you can pull that poll. If there's a way for you to connect and support your team, even sharing some of the things that you're doing, getting your teams to challenge one another with, there's a push-up challenge that my son's doing with his classmates, just ways to introduce some fun, but some fun that really produces a good focus on wellness. So that's really what I wanted to chat with you about today, was the 3 pillars of our strategy of leading through crisis and helping to support our leaders as they lead their teams through crisis. Hopefully there's been something that's resonated with you, which is really my last slide. Using the chat, is there anything today that you feel like you want to put in practice or you want to take away with you, like the footprint in the sand? I'll give you just a few moments to use the chat. All right, well, as you reflect on that, we're coming close to the top of the hour, and I did want to take a moment to really thank Pete and Tina and Alex. Thank you so much to the AAMA team for having me. I hope that today was a worthwhile discussion, that you got some insight into how we're talking about leadership at Cineplex. And thank you to John Brady from Player One Amusement Group for thinking of the idea to share some of these learnings with the community. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and to hang out with you today. And I'll hang out on the chat for a couple more minutes if anyone's got any questions. But thank you, Thomas, leading instead of simply managing. I love that. Thanks, Judy. Appreciate you being here. Thanks, John.
Yeah, Allison, you've been extraordinarily beneficial to the community, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to put this together and sharing your insight and knowledge with us. Clearly, Cineplex is in good hands with their communication within their team, with leaders like you on board, and I certainly picked up a lot today, and I'm sure many others did as well.
Well, thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and with that, I want to thank everyone for participating. We will have another webinar next week, although because of the Memorial Day weekend, which seems surreal given the context that it's occurring in, we're going to move our webinar from Tuesday to Thursday at 10:30 a.m. So please stay tuned. That will be another panel conversation centering around those organizations that are experiencing some level of reopening. We're putting together the panel now, and I'm excited about the participants we've got thus far and hope to grow it even more. But yeah, thanks for your engagement. Thanks for staying connected. Everyone have a wonderful and safe Memorial Day weekend, and I look forward to speaking with you next week, Thursday.